on to the next part of discussing how the interrelations take place within castes.
The increasing polarization and communalization, it also further shows us the complexity of social relations around the landfill site. Uh, Now, because there is so much communalization and it's increasing on everyday basis, we we are yet to know how Bengali Muslims are suffering because, I mean, as I stated, they're numerically dominant. They've become like these professional waste pickers in the area, and I would say to some extent in the rest of the city as well. But now they are also seen with a sense of suspicion. Earlier, people were not so much aware of their Bengali Muslim identity. And what happens is that many times when we talk about Bengali Muslims, they're seen as Bangladeshis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a sense of stigma. We do not like. I was talking to somebody other day, and some people said that waste because that some people do not want to give them their waste because they're Muslims, and then they're on top of
Mm-hmm.
it, they're Bengali Muslims. So, and there have a couple of incidents have happened that, they've made their conditions further more precarious at a more communal level. So we do not know what it entails yet, but over last 30, 40 years, they've created this whole economy and we do not know what are going to be the repercussions of it over a period of time, because
Mm-hmm.
as it stands, of course, Bengali Muslims, they're collecting garbage from middle class households, and they're collecting, like, they're going to the landfills. But I'm sure, like, their existence it's not in isolation. It operates in function with rest of the city. So one is yet to know that what is happening in that domain. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what really um, like came out from from your description is that there's so much to know when it comes to being oppressed and being the oppressor both. Because the general notion is that the oppressor is defined as the well-to-do party who are socially much more well-to-do, who economically more well-to-do, and the oppressed has the topsy-turvy the other way around. But I think what's really important from your findings is that you point out that's not 100% true, but rather there could be instances where oppression can exist within the oppressed parties. I think that's really, really interesting to look at and also really eye-opening as a researcher for myself as well. And I think it would be really also interesting to discuss one of the key points that you also discuss, that you talk about continuities of sanitation. And just before we started the conversation, you pointed out that you haven't really explored the colonial sanitation regimes. But it would be really interesting and enlightening for our listeners to hear how the present day waste management takes place and what are the new logics that have emerged in today's sort of neoliberal governance that actually differs from the past. So, since you have had a lot of experience with the field and especially how waste management happens in Delhi, it would be really great if you can enlighten us on that a little bit as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Malith, for that fantastic question. Yeah, so, over a period of time, a lot has changed when it comes to sanitation workers, especially when we think of their position within the neoliberal regime of urban governance. So, say to think of one is that, even though Balmiki community workers, they detest this work, it has been imposed on them historically. They have to face the brunt of stigma, they're humiliated every now and then. They take up this work,
Mhm.
sanitation work, because it's a government job and it gives them a sense of stability. And that's why many of them, like, earlier, what would happen is that this job was to some extent also based on hereditary relations. And so they would take it up from their father or mother if one of them retires. That
Mhm.
has really completely ended over a period of time. And earlier, what would happen is that the jobs were permanent, and when they retire they would get their salaries, they would get a house when they got the job. Now the thing is that there is a shift from this permanent job to a more contractual one, and it operates at different levels. So some of them are temporary workers,
Mhm.
some of them are contractual workers. Contractual in the sense that they would get the job when somebody else is absent or
Mhm.
somebody else cannot come. And temporary in the sense that, simply like as the term in itself defines, that they're hired, but they're not yet permanent, so they do
Mhm.
not get the same salary as permanent workers would do. So for example, when I was conducting my fieldwork, and I'm sure since then things have changed, so this is around 2019. So if a permanent worker is getting 40,000, a temporary worker would get 14 or 15,000, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
it's then much more beneficial for the government to, hire them on temporary basis than to hire them on permanent basis. So this is one aspect which has clearly come about in this whole neoliberal regime of governance, especially the fact that like, now let's talk about Swachh Bharat, because cleaning came under that. Like sanitation work is, like, over a period of time, it is part of Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. So if you're cleaning the city, you cannot clean the city without thinking about the cleaners of the city, right? And they have not really benefited from the program if there is growing contractualization within this space. So now a lot of sanitation workers told me that, earlier they would get brooms, they
Mhm.
would get they would so the broomsticks, they, of course, they get damaged over a period of time, right? So they have to continuously change it. So,
Mhm.
and they would earlier get it from the government, now they just get something very substandard, and they have to peel it on their own in order to do their work properly.
Yeah.
So one is that. Then second is that they would get cleaning equipments, they would get soap, they would get uniforms, and now lot of it is not available to them. So you see, over a period of time, we see that there has been a fund cut within this job. So as much as we are trying to clean the cities,
Mhm.
what is happening? So of course, one is the fact that they do not want to do this job, but if they're doing this job, they want better working conditions. And we see so yeah, I said that now there is a decline in their in terms of the financial needs that they require, right? So there are massive fund cuts in terms of the cleaning equipments, in terms of their salaries. Now, on top of it, what is happening is privatization of
Mhm.
sanitation work and in general waste management processes in the city. So since I think 2005 or 2007, we see the coming of public private partnerships in the city. So what is happening is, of course, now they are they have not been so much in the domain of sanitation work. Sanitation here, by sanitation work, I mean sweeping of the streets. But what they do is they do a lot of waste collection, right? So now a lot of Balmiki workers who were working as sanitation workers, they're hired by these private companies as garbage collectors,
Okay.
right? So they're Balmikis only, because anyways the government is not making them permanent. They're hiring them on contractual basis.
Mhm.
So now company comes in between under the rubric of public-private partnerships,
Mhm.
and the company starts hiring them. And the company, of course, hires them at a very at a very contractual level, right? So the company is also giving them the same salary as the government would, say, of 14,000 or 15,000. So you see the contrast that is happening, because under a private public private regime, you do not have the scope of becoming a permanent
Mhm.
salaried worker.
Yeah.
And the companies then project themselves in a way that they are beyond the question of caste, right? So it's that they're professionals, they don't care, they just want workers.
Mhm.
But in my experience, I noticed that, and I confirmed with other sanitation workers as well, that so the driver, so the way it operates is that there is a collection van which comes. One person is driving the van and other person is collecting garbage, so people come with their buckets, with the bins, and then they dispose it in the van. So the person who's collecting the garbage is from the Balmiki community, and the person who's driving the van is from relatively upper caste community. The ones
Okay.
I met were from Jat community, so they're like this dominant OBC communities. So
Okay.
you see that the caste relations again, like one would imagine that with privatization, private players coming in, they wouldn't really care about the caste question, but then caste seeps in because it's such a structural element of our society that it really cannot go away no matter how hard we try. And these private companies are built in a way that they uh, they build themselves on these structural inequalities because they are here to make profit, right?
Hmm.
So it would actually be we would be misleading ourselves if we think that professionalization of waste management services under this umbrella of neoliberal governance would actually do away with these elements. They further re-entrench those elements, but they sort of become more invisible because now we don't realize who's picking our waste. They're wearing uniforms, all of
Hmm.
that with like big capital in their hand. And yeah, so it's not operating at a more informal level as it would. And the second thing that happens is that sanitation workers in Delhi, the Balmiki community, they were politically very, very active. They had their unions,
Okay.
right? So now with the coming of private companies, there is no scope of unionization because it's if they have to secure their jobs, they cannot go for protest. They cannot form these unions because they can easily be fired by these private companies. And earlier, I think one of the ways Balmiki community has been able to make their foothold in the city is because of the caste history, the way they have interacted with various governments, whether it was the colonial government, whether it was Congress. They have a whole history with Congress, which I'm not going to discuss in this
Hmm.
podcast. And now with BJP. So they continuously protest because if you're a permanent worker and you've been by the virtue of your caste, you've been forced to do this work. They had this moral they have this moral burden of fighting for
Hmm.
their rights, right? So
Yeah.
they have been very strongly doing so over 70, 80 years now, which now is sort of on a decline because of growing privatization in this realm. Yeah.
I think something that you briefly touched on, Aparna, is that how sort of materiality of waste sort of plays a role when it comes to how waste management functions, because you pointed out how waste collection is done by a particular caste, and maybe almost of the time that the driver would be from a different caste. So that drives me to question, like, does the changes in materiality of waste from, let's say, organic to recyclable impact caste hierarchies and the economic value of waste work? Because that's something, economic value of waste work changing with materiality is something that we do observe. But does that have an impact on caste by any chance? Did you manage to notice this?
Absolutely, absolutely. Like the whole thesis has been about that. So basically, when you see the coming of these different communities and
Hmm.
other than the Valmikis and engaging in waste work, that is because of the materiality of waste. So say who would want to do waste work unless it's not reaping the economic benefits. So I mean, like I said, Balmikis have been doing this work because it was a permanent job and they were not getting
Hmm.
money by like at a very informal level. In some instances they were getting money by selling these materials, say even wet waste, organic waste they could sell as as compost, right?
Manual.
But not so much of that. Mostly it was the lure of permanent job, right? But now when we see with the coming of these informal communities getting into waste work selling, it's all because of the change in the materiality of discarded materials. So say for example, earlier, like I said, I iterated that, sanitation workers were mostly dealing with dust, compost, vegetable peels. They were mostly dealing with soil, human excreta. And that came in the sense of more like social reproduction of the city, that the cities have to be clean, right?
Mm.
But with the increase in like with the boom in economy, with the production of mass consumption products, the production here becomes the center point. As the production has increased, so have these, consumer materials over a period of time. So, and then, like, of course, subsequently there is increasing consumerism, and then we see all kinds of products landing at the landfill site, whether it is our phones, whether it is our
Mm.
shoes, pen. I mean, you name it. And I mean, in that sense, landfills are the archives of modern day living, right?
Mhm.
So, of course, these materials have value. Different materials, metals will have more value, plastic will have different kind of value, paper will have different kind of value, right? So, and that is the reason that informal waste pickers from different caste communities have taken up this work, because they can sell these materials. Some of them, they even form their niche.
Mm.
They become so professionalized, like a one waste picker or a scrap dealer can differentiate between 50 kinds of plastics.
Wo-
Which, when I did my fieldwork, it was quite astounding for me that, somebody specializing one may not be even aware of different kinds of
Yeah,
plastics, right?
exactly.
But they are making quality, they call it quality making. And they make like different qualities from, say, HD, LD, PP, that's polypropylene, all
Hmm.
these kinds of high density plastics. So they segregate into different types of plastics and then sell it to scrap dealers, and then the whole value chain goes. So that becomes one of the whole reasons that they get into this economy, other than the reasons that precarity, of the reasons of it offering them more flexibility in terms of their work routine. So all of that. Yeah.
Hmm. And I think one last thing that I want to touch upon, Aparna, is that like even though that your focus is not predominantly on how external forces can have changes on the lives of waste workers and the Wastescape in general, because our project, the Spirit project, focuses on how the COVID-19 actually impacted the waste work in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, and our previous study as well, the MSWM project also focused on India a little bit, but the focus was in Kerala. Tenas, the friend, was part of. So because of my pure interest and because we are one of our key objectives is to look at the impact of COVID-19, have you noticed any major changes that have come over time as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Like you said, I'm not sure if I'm in the best position to answer that question,
Hmm.
especially at the level of political economy, because, of course, the whole value chain was affected when the COVID-19 hit, right?
Course,
So,
yeah.
there were two things that happened. One was that the access for informal waste pickers to the middle class households became difficult, and that
Hmm.
became difficult because of policing and surveillance, that, who is going where,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
uh, I mean, over a period of time they were allowed, but initially they were not allowed. One was that. Second was that lot of them, waste pickers, they collect their materials for a month or so,
Hmm.
and then sell it, because the reason they do is that they're also waiting that, oh, the market is up and
Yeah,
down for plastic right now, maybe for
exactly.
metal. So waiting what the market prices are, and then they sell them in bulk. If they, those who are at the very lowest rung of the economy, they may sell it on daily basis for to just to live their
Yeah,
everyday living, make their living. But otherwise, those who have climbed up a little bit also on that ladder, they try to collect those materials and then sell it. Now, what happened when the COVID-19 hit was that a lot of them had collected those materials, right? And they could not sell it to the scrap
exactly.
dealers.
Yeah.
So the because so actually I mapped the whole value chain in my thesis. So the where the landfill is, industrial area is not very far from the landfill. Say by car, it's not more than 30 to 40 minutes. So at least when you're dealing in plastic waste, you, through the intermediaries, scrap dealers, and small traders, you ultimately sell it to the factory dealers who are actually recycling the materials.
Mhm.
Now, if the factories are shut, how do you sell those materials and to whom, right? So now, in that sense, waste becomes absolutely value zero. Very often when we talk about definition of waste, we also say that there cannot be any one definition of waste, because as the market relations are changing, so what becomes of waste, that is also drastically changing. And that is what happened during COVID-19 with many scrap dealers. What also happened is that sometimes they're in debt because people say that they're going to take money from them but not give them all the, in India, or they often call it mal, like
Yeah, yeah.
a big stack of, like
Hmm.
a stack that they're carrying, they call it mal. So now you've given the money but you don't receive the mal, right? So now who gets hurt in the process
Yeah.
is the ones who are at the most lower rung of the economy. So, of course, because if you are a capitalist, if you're a factory dealer, recycler, you will have some capital. But these people, those who are at the most like waste pickers, they do not have that sort of capital, right? So, in that sense, it becomes difficult for them to sustain. But one interesting thing that happened during COVID-19 was also because lockdowns were in phases, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
At least in India. So, the everyday consumption pattern had really increased. So, household waste, say,
Hmm.
especially
Exactly.
packaging material had really increased. So these waste pickers, after a point of time, who could come to the middle class colonies, and as the market picked up, because these factories were not closed for very long, I think after 1.5, 2 months, people started going to work, as far as I remember, especially the factory dealers. So these lot of waste pickers did make money out of that. So that sort of helped. But when we are talking about more about industrial waste, so I met a lot of scrap dealers who deal in newspaper waste, one,
Yeah.
and they deal in office papers. So
Oh.
now offices were completely closed, and since then many offices have gone work from home, right? So they do not get those papers and files that they would get earlier. So
Mhm.
that completely changes the whole game. So those, because after a point of time, one starts dealing in specialized materials, and if one was dealing in that domain, then they were at huge loss. So there were many of these changes that happened, but at a more structural level, you ask me, I don't think I'm the best person to comment on that.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
thank you so much, Aparna, because it's quite an interesting thing that has happened in my lifetime and your lifetime. COVID-19, one of I think can be seen as one of the most significant junctures uh, in our lifetimes because it changed everything from policy to economy, and I think some people got more closer to religion. Like it became more and more intrusive in every aspect and dimension of life. So thank you so much for bringing in that insights as well as a person who was living in Delhi. And I think thank you so much, Aban. I think we have to thank you not just because you shared your experiences and your the knowledge that you gathered in your PhD studies, but now I think our viewers who are either from India or from other parts of the world would also get a bit of a I think I would say a bit of a comprehensive picture about how the caste system works in the Wastescape at least, and how complex it is, and that's why. And also, I think your answers provide us a partial answer to why is it so difficult to answer caste as a phenomenon, because it has so many intricacies throughout this interweaven throughout the society that there is no one simple answer to it. So I think we have to thank you for that, Aparna, for bringing that out. And I would like to thank you again for joining the podcast. And also, I would like to congratulate you on all the great work that you're doing. And I just remembered what the food item that you cook. It was palak paneer. It just came to my mind. That was super good. So thank you so much, Aparna, again for joining with us. Hopefully, maybe we can have you again in the podcast as a guest, so that we can talk more about your postdoctoral work also.
Thank you so much, Malith. Thank you so much for having me over and for these brilliant, brilliant, insightful questions. They help me also, it's always good to go back to your work, reflect on it, and
Mhm.
yeah, so that was great. And yes, I haven't made my palak paneer since the time you've left to make it again.
Yeah, maybe it's
Thank you
time.
for having me over. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Aparna. Thank you. Then, thank you for our listeners for joining in, and thank you for our viewers for joining in. Please do join with us for our next podcast. We will be with Professor Sweta Rao, and you would be able to get to know more about how the project works and what have been our key focuses throughout these past 3 years and in the coming remaining year. Thank you again, Aparna. Hope you guys have a great day.